Day number 1. I'm building a new computer. The first parts arrived today. Clockwise from the top is the motherboard. Solid-state disk drives, known as SSDs. Random access memory, called RAM. The power supply. And the operating system, abbreviated OS, in the middle of it all. Day number 2. This is an old computer case that I had laying around. Pictured together with the new power supply. The view is of the mid-size tower case, laying on its side with the side panels removed. The motherboard will drop straight down into the open cavity. And the power supply will slide into the opening shown here at the rear right. The 3 black rounded corner rectangles are rubber covers with slits for power supply and other cables which can be routed underneath the motherboard mounting plate. The computer case is a fractal design R6, which I love for its flexibility and quietness. This is the way the tower will stand after all the parts are in. The view is from the underside of the motherboard mounting plate. The power supply is partially slid into place. Notice the underside black mounting plates, shown, lower right, for 2.5-inch SSDs or laptop drives. Also notice the little circuit board in the middle that can drive and control extra fans. And the topside ventilation opening which can support a triple fan assembly, if I can squeeze one in. I've removed a top plate, using the big white release button, to expose the opening, but I might put it back if I don't end up going with a radiator and or fans there. There's also room behind the power supply for a double radiator, which is probably where I'll put one if there is enough room left by the cables plugged into the back of the supply. This is another view of the case, with the front door ajar and the power supply pushed into place. The inside of the door has acoustic insulation and cleverly concealed venting for a pair of double fans. When I put the side panels back, they also deaden sound with more insulation. I like the fact that there's a drive bay at the top so I can install a disk drive plug-in unit for removable serial ATA, commonly called Sata, SSDs. This view also shows drive trays inside that are all removable to accommodate super long video boards. I've already removed more than 1/2 of the 10 that were there. Also visible is a fan at the back which I'll be removing and replacing with a special CPU radiator that has not come in yet. Now that I know that it fits, I've pulled the power supply out so I can more easily plug in the cables that I'm pretty sure I'll be using soon. Clockwise from the top, I have 2 cables for PCI video boards, 3 cables for motherboard CPU power, and 2 more for SATA SSDs. High-end video boards typically use 2 connectors from a single power cable, but I like to use separate cables for each connector. Each SATA power cable can power 4 SATA disk or SSD drives, but the CPU cooling unit and fan power expansion board also use these connectors, so I'll snake one cable up by the front panel for the removable SATA plug bay, and the second one to the underside of the motherboard mounting frame for SATA SSDs that I might install there or for other stuff. The cables are all plugged into the power supply and ready to be snaked into the case. The power supply is back in, and I've pulled everything out of the way. Except for the CPU power cables which I've arranged near where they will eventually plug into the motherboard. This is so I can visualize where to best snake them into the case now. Looking at the motherboard power connectors, I've snaked the CPU cables on the underside of the board mounting plate into the rubber openings near where the motherboard connectors will end up after I drop the board into the case. But before I put the board into the case, I want to install everything onto it that I possibly can, ahead of time, while it's more easily accessible. Pictured at the bottom are the 2 Samsung M.2 SSDs that I'll be using. These are the newest PCIe 4 Model 980 versions, which is a new standard implemented by this motherboard. The 500GB drive will boot the OS. The 2TB drive will be my high-speed video edit drive. In this photo, I am putting the operating system boot drive into place after removing the top cover of M.2 slot number 1. I also had to peel off 2 pieces of plastic film which covered pre-applied thermal joining compound which enhances cooling. The 2TB work drive installs similarly. There's room to add a total of 4 M.2 drives, but the additional 2 would share bandwidth with video which I'd rather avoid. Fast forward to day number 5. The CPU and cooler arrived today. So they're going in next. I went ahead here and screwed the fan onto its radiator. This is what's known as an all-in-one, AIO, liquid cooling unit. The coolant water is pre-installed, sealed in, and maintenance-free. This is a first for me. I've only ever used air cooling before. I'll be mounting the radiator into the case in place of the rear chassis fan, and then bolting the round pump assembly into intimate contact with the CPU. The posts, pictured at the right, go into holes from the top of the motherboard and screw into the plastic frame shown below them which mounts on the underside of the board. The CPU is an Intel i9 11900K, which is kind of the successor to the i9 9900K which I used in a computer I built 3 years ago. It features a more efficient design that runs cooler and at higher speed. It also has 512-bit registers which are 8 times as wide as the 64-bit registers of most previous generation CPUs. It also has an internal graphics processing unit, iGPU, which is a member of Intel's newest Iris family and is reputed to have more capability and higher performance than the older one built into the 9900K. I'm looking forward to comparing their performance. The CPU is now clamped into its socket assembly and framed by the mounting posts of the cooling unit. I had a bit of trouble with the underside frame and topside mounting posts. The board seems to be thinner than the post and frame design, so I had to add some washers to the underside to snug everything up. The board is now almost ready to be bolted into the case. But before I put the motherboard into the case, here is another part that's new to me. A tiny high-speed fan that mounts onto the voltage regulator module heatsink. It's supposed to provide extra cooling for overclocking. Sure, why not? The motherboard is now bolted into place. The radiator is mounted where the chassis fan used to be, and the AIO pump is affixed to the top of the CPU by thumb screws on the mounting posts. The pump came with pre-applied thermal joining compound, but I had to add a dab of Arctic Freeze after a few false starts. I am waiting to plug the memory into its sockets until I check that nothing interferes. It looks like it will be a tight fit, but looks good if I reorient a couple of wires. I'm going with 64 GB of RAM, which is probably a little overkill. But I'm hoping it will make this computer be more future-proof. I wasn't looking for it, but this package came with a memory cooling fan. That's another first for me. Looking good. The memory sticks are plugged in, and there is plenty of clearance for the cooling tubes and control wiring. The cooling fan for the memory is now clamped onto the side clips of its sockets and looks great. Next is the hard part, doing BIOS updates followed by OS install, driver and firmware updates. And then burn-in stress tests, software installation, with more testing and benchmarking every step of the way. Give me a couple of days. Fast forward a couple of days. The SATA plug-in tray has arrived. This tray is the size of a 3.5-inch floppy drive, and can hold a pair of SATA hot swap SSDs like the SanDisk Ultra. Each SSD requires its own power cable and SATA signal cable, one of which is shown plugged into the tray for now. The tray came with a special Molex to Sata power adapter with a tap wire to power the drive activity LED, so I'll be using a Molex tap into the power supply rather than the more direct Sata power attachment. The computer case has a 5 1/4 inch drive bay, so I'll be mounting the plug tray into the adapter frame pictured above. Here it is with both trays wired up and ready to go. And now in place in the case's drive bay, with an SSD partially inserted before being latched in. Now it's time for the moment of truth. I've closed it up, plugged in the little magnetic Wi-Fi antenna, connected the power cord and fired it up. The power button lights up, so I wired that correctly. The SSD in the tray also lights the activity LED, so I did that right too. With a monitor plugged into the motherboard HDMI port, the first thing to appear is the BIOS setup menu. And the first thing I want to do is change the hot plug settings for SATA ports number 1 and number 2 from disabled to enabled. The BIOS has already detected the SanDisk Ultra in the tray. I've made those two changes, so now I'll save them and restart the BIOS. Here are some other important changes to make in BIOS settings. Disabling the compatibility support module is necessary to enable both motherboard graphics and a plug-in video board. I will want to use both together for faster video editing. After a few more saves and restarts, I've gone into the systems agent to set a PCIe video board as my primary display, and the motherboard iGPU as an active secondary graphics processor. That way video editing software can use them both. In this screen I also effectively disable secure boot, so I can install an operating system from a CD. The BIOS normally wants to prevent doing this for security reasons. I set OS type to other and secure boot to custom. At this point I have already put the Win 10 Pro installation CD in a USB reader which appeared under boot override, where you now see the Windows Boot Manager installed to the 980M.2 Samsung SSD. Installing the OS and all the updates and patches via Wi-Fi took a couple of hours. The next steps will be installing drivers and software installation for burn-in and other testing. And finally installing video editing application software. Now that I have an operating system, I'll be able to capture things to video instead of just photos with my cell phone. That will be in part number 2. See you then.